Well, welcome to, I think this is lecture number 17. It's hard to believe that we're still sticking with this, but I'm really happy that we are. I didn't have as much time to prepare this week, so it might be a little shorter, which may actually be a good thing, but we'll see. We were in the beginning, we were up to chapter 17, part 1. So in the Pines, that would be page 42 of the first volume. And Rambam, in his usual disorganized organization, while he's going through terms, and remember, until chapter 16, he was bringing a term and then translating, what its translation is, and then showing what it really means when it's used in the context of God or other spiritual issues described in Tanakh. So chapter 17, he goes off on a little tangent. But everything builds, all the little tangents build to help us construct the way Rambam looks and wants to teach us how to look at the Torah in general. So these tangents are really important. And this one, he also goes off on a little bit of some philosophy. So we'll get a little bit of Plato and Aristotle thrown in here now. So chapter 17 in the English reads in Pines, do not think. So remember, again, the Rambam has been translating words, and he's hinting to us that when we start analyzing the Torah and the words of the prophets themselves, we're going to have to recognize that a lot of it is written in what he calls parables. A lot of it is written with terms that seem to mean one thing on a simple level, but on a deeper level, they mean something else. So he's anticipating a question that might be forming in our minds, and that is, why in the world is it written in this secretive way that it should be so difficult? Why didn't it just write it out clearly? And in part, we're also going to find, and this is a very basic part of Judaism, is the idea of the oral tradition, right? That when we received the Torah, it wasn't just the words that we received, it's also there's an oral tradition that goes along with it. And Rambam, throughout Moreh Nevuchim, throughout this book, he is going to tell us that why it is that way, why there's so much that has passed on from student to teacher, from father to son, from generation to generation, and knowledge that we build upon with analysis, with thinking, with interpretation, and so on. Why is that not, if that's all part of the Torah, why is that not just written clearly? So this little tangent here is part of the building blocks for our understanding of how Judaism works, which is, why is it structured in such a way that there's a written Torah that sometimes seems so cryptic and difficult to understand, and an oral tradition, which is so much broader and so much more detailed and so much less accessible to the average person. So this is one of the building blocks of that. And we'll see as Rambam continues to build. And I really want you to remember that each and every one of these small chapters, even when it's just a translation of a word, is really a building block. And if we follow through the whole time, then when he gets to as he goes on and explains deeper and deeper subjects, if we get the building blocks, we'll get what he's trying to say. So here he goes, do not think, and I'm starting chapter 17 in the Pines, do not think that only the divine science should be withheld from the multitude. In other words, when it's written in such a way that people can't simply understand what the words mean on a surface level, it's not just the Torah, it's not just the Bible that's written that way, right? It's also science is that way too. And in Rambam's mind, remember, science, it is what he learned and understood through Plato and Aristotle, and then the Aristotelian thinkers that followed him. So this holds good for the greater part of natural science. In fact, we have repeatedly set down for you, if you remember way back in the beginning, the Rambam's Maaseh Bereshit, the account of the beginning, is equivalent to science. Rambam feels that when the Torah refers to Maaseh Bereshit, the account of the beginning, that is what we would call today science, right? It ought not to be taught in the presence of two men. We said that Chazal, the rabbis, taught us that science shouldn't be professed in public. It has to be taught carefully from individual to individual. And what does that mean? This is not only the case with regard to people adhering to law. This is not just true regarding to people that keep the Torah. Like if you're teaching people that want to be loyal to the Torah, so you should be careful when you teach science. It's also true with regard to the philosophers and learned men of the various communities in ancient times. Now I'm gonna have to say something a little bit outside on my own to explain a little bit of one of the basics ideas in Platonic and in Aristotelian philosophy is the idea of what's called in Hebrew, we find the terms Homer and Surah. In English, we call it matter and form. That everything has a matter, which is the substance of which something is made. And then the form refers to literally the form which it takes. It's not just the form, it's also what does the matter do? What are its actions? What effects it has on other things? What other things, how other things affect it? That the form is so matter is in Aristotelian philosophy is made up of combinations of 4 types of matter, which is, you may be familiar with earth, fire, wind, and water, right? And then it mixes in its various ways, and we would today say the elements make up the basis of matter. So the idea is still true today. There is matter, but then form is when you take all that matter and you mix it together, all of those elements could make a lion, it could make a giraffe, it could make a blade of grass, it could make a virus, right? The same thing in those days, they would have said that form mixes to create it. So it when you mix it in a certain way, it takes on a certain form as a human being, as a mountain, as a sea, or whatever it is, the form that it takes. So Rambam is saying when Plato described, and then I say, for they concealed what they said about the first principles and presented it in riddles. They also, when they wrote their books and tried to describe it to the public, they also tried to describe it in a way that's simplified. It's kind of like nowadays, you might encounter an article online or in a magazine, simplifying the theory of relativity, explaining it in layman's terms, what relativity means. Because if you try to explain it in its detail, if we're not Einstein or genius physicists ourselves, we start twisting our brains in 6 different directions without being able to understand it. But we try to simplify it, even though when you simplify it, you may actually be leaving out major important things or you may even be misrepresenting things. And he explains here that Plato and his predecessors designated matter as female and form as male. They used that analogy to explain to the public the idea of matter and form. And when they did that, and now I'm speaking outside now myself to explain so you understand the next few sentences. When they did that, they left out one of the most important ideas when it comes to that philosophical concept, or in Rambam's time, the line between philosophy and science, there was no line. They were one and the same. So the philosophical / scientific concept of matter and form, it's important to remember what in English, the translation that Pines uses is particularized privation. In Hebrew, it's heder, which is the last one of heder but I'm going to explain what it means in modern English in a way that we can understand. When you take matter, right, and you make it into a human being, right? So the human being, sorry? Yeah, I thought someone had to say something. When you take matter and you turn it into a, sorry, I muted myself by accident for a minute. When you take matter and you, give me 1 second. Sorry. Okay. I just muted everyone, so to eliminate background noise. If you want to speak, just go ahead and unmute yourself. Let's say you take matter and you make it into, and it's made into something. Matter, let's say a person. Now, that person changes, right? Something changes that person. He or she is a baby, and then they're a toddler, and then and so on. Every day, we constantly changing. We move things, we do things. So there's some kind of a force that takes that matter animates it or drives it and makes it be something else. And that force is constantly renewing and constantly changing. And what the philosophers looked at this, and they called it, the English translation is particularized privation, meaning matter can't just be a massive energy that's just helter-skelter running all over the place. Something has to be regulating that energy and forcing it and pushing it in a certain direction to do a certain thing. So if you look at particularized privation, it would be easier if you translated it as a energy or a force that animates an object, which constantly changes all the way to the point of death, right? Because we get older, and then we end, right? And we deteriorate back to the earth and become back the matter which we were when we started, without that form, and then goes around again, and so on. That matter, the earth becomes some form of life, and et cetera, et cetera. So when the Rambam refers to the term corruption, generation and corruption, generation means the bringing into existence of a new form, usually of life, but it could be of any object. And corruption is when that form returns to its original source and ceases to exist as what it was. So all that is necessary to understand the next few sentences. And then, since it's good that it was detailed, because then you'll understand exactly what Rambam's point is. Because what I just told you was a highfalutin philosophical sounding idea, right? And when you're talking to normal people, Plato would have said, it's like there's matter and there's form, kind of like male and female. I don't really know. We'd have to go through and read Plato to see exactly how male and female represents matter and form. But to be honest, I really don't care. The point is he oversimplified this complicated concept, and he completely ignored, and Rambam is about to say, now that you know that because people reading this book are educated, you realize that the principles of the existence subject to generation and corruption of all things that exist, things that come to be and things that cease to exist, are not two, which can be summarized in male and female, but there are three. There's matter, form, and particularized privation, which is always conjoined with matter. Without this force, this animating force, matter would just remain matter, right? For were it not for this conjunction privation, matter would not receive form. It would never become anything. It would never turn into anything. It is in this sense that privation is to be considered as one of the principles. It's one of the main things. You can't explain matter and form without explaining the force that makes matter into form, right? However, when a form is achieved, once it gets to where it's going, the particular privation in question, the force, the privation of the form that is achieved disappears, and it keeps going another one and another one. The forces keep on changing, which is how the ancient philosophers explain why things change over time, right? And this goes on forever, as has been made clear in natural science. For those of us that have studied, and remember, Rambam assumed that we studied science, which in his mind is exactly what we just learned. But nonetheless, Plato explained it very simply. So Rambam is just saying that just like they had to explain it that way, the Torah had to explain it the Torah's way. When the Torah said God spoke, it said it in a simple, easy way for people to understand. When the Torah said God made, it said it in a simple way for people to understand. When the Torah said God is strong, it's a simple and easy way for people to understand, even though the depth, the wisdom behind it is so much more and so much deeper. And this is the point that Rambam is trying to make in this chapter. So Rambam says, if this is true, and I'm using my own words now, and then I'll read it in the Pines translation. If this is true for scientific matters that have nothing to do with religious belief, fundamental belief in God, right? Then how much more so should that be true when we're talking about religious matters that are so fundamental and important, and the danger of making the mistake is so much higher. So, now as even those upon whom the charge of corruption, in other words, if a person is making a mistake in a scientific matter, so what? Rambam says, no big deal. So they don't understand what matter is and what form is and what forces are. They'll still go about their daily lives. They'll still be able to do whatever it is that they do for a living and go about their lives. But no one's going to tell them you're a heretic. You don't get God, right? Because that's the charge of corruption here. In the Hebrew translation is the charge of similar to a charge of like blasphemy. would not be laid in the event of a clear exposition of use term figurative and resorting to teaching and similes. So no one's going to say, okay, you don't get it, right? But they still resorted to using these kinds of parables in order to explain complicated concepts. How much all the more is it incumbent upon us, the community of those adhering to the law, those of us in the community that believe in the Torah and want to understand the Torah, how much more important it is not to state explicitly a matter, not to try to go and explain in detail something that is either remote from the understanding of the multitude or the truth of which, as it appears to the imagination of these people, is different from it is intended by us. Know this also. In other words, how much more important it is for us to be really careful that if we go into the details of the details and confuse people in a way that they won't understand, that we shouldn't do that. So here Rambam went on this little tangent to bring this comparison to regular science. And I think that, what we find in today's world when I encounter this in my field, which is science-based, I hope, of medicine, and most of us practice in some sort of a field where there is a body of knowledge of science or, which backs up what we do. At least I hope so, right? Those of, whether we're dealing in law or economics or, and when you deal with the general public, it's important to explain things in ways that people can understand, in ways that people can handle, even if sometimes it's a major oversimplification. I wanted to know if, before I go on, because I want to do chapter 18 and 19 tonight. But before we do that, any comments on what Rambam just said?
Yeah, I just have a simple question.
Yes.
From his perspective, how exclusive is this community of people that are really qualified to address these matters in the complexity that's necessary? Are we talking about 10 men? Are we talking about 1,000? I'm just trying to get a sense of how exclusive this club is.
Well, that's a really good question. I think that my belief is that in the Rambam's time, in his day, because real education was limited to very few, and the vast majority of the public really didn't have access to education, the numbers were pretty small. There was a small select part of the population that had the ability. Most people didn't have the time or the finances to do it. But nowadays, I think that number is widened because education is more accessible to more people. There's still this dichotomy. There are still people that are uneducated, of course, but I think the circle has widened, and I think that if we can understand this chapter, then we already probably joined the group of people that Rambam is talking to. I hope. Okay. Can anyone think of an example in their lives where this principle has proven true or not true? And if not, I'm going to go on to the next. Yeah, go ahead.
These privations, the Friedlander translates it as absence. I'm just trying to understand exactly what that sounds like. Is that energy? Would we call that energy?
Yeah, that's really good. I translated it as energy, and I didn't make that up on my own. Kapach in the Hebrew edition that I use, he goes through a lengthy explanation of what it means. And his Hebrew translation is he'eder, which is very similar to the English privation, right? However, I'll read you the Hebrew. Let me find it. First of all, the he'eder is Hatsamud l'chomer, which is attached to the chomer, hu hagorem lo lanoa. That is what causes it to move likrat kabbalat tzura, in order to approach and attain its form. And if not, v'lulei haheder, if not for this heder, right, lo haya hachomer na, then the chomer would not move. So I was thinking energy, just like you were, right? And then he says, you can even explain it or even translate it with the following phrase. And this is really nails it. It helped me understand what this means. HaChomer v'hashe'ifa l'kabbalat hatzura, which is the chomer, meaning the matter, and the she'ifa, meaning the drive or the push, right, to attain a form, kedei latzeit el hapoel, in order to go from something that's just a concept to something that actually is a vihatzura, and the shape. So therefore, it's something there's something animating the matter and making it into the form. You can have a matter, you have a form, but why did the matter decide to become the form, right? So there's some force that's pushing it to go from A to B. And that's what this head there is. That's what this particular privation is. Yeah, go ahead.
What is the Rambam's ultimate conclusion here? That because for those people who fall outside the select group who can really understand these complicated concepts, nothing should be explained to them. Things should be explained to them in such a way so that they don't understand it and they don't seek to delve any more deeply, or things should be explained to them in a simple way so that they understand it to their own level of capacity.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I really like that question. There's going to be a tiny hint at the end of chapter 19, which we will get to hopefully tonight, where we get a hint as to what Rambam, and there were a couple places until this point where Rambam said, if people imagine that XYZ is true, even though it's not true, it's not so bad, right? And Rambam is going to drop those hints along the way. So if people think that when it talks about God's light filling the world, that it actually means light filling the world as opposed to knowledge and intellect and understanding of God, fine. So let them think that there's going to be some form of light. That's actually what we're going to read soon. I'm giving it away. So, I'm sorry. That only partly answers your question because on one level, certain understandings, Rambam says, let's just let them keep it that way because it's okay. There's no terrible danger if they don't get it. But there's one thing that Rambam said that everyone absolutely needs to know. And he codified that in the 13 principles of faith, right? As long as the person understands that God has no form and that all of these things are just parables and that God doesn't have a shape of a body and he doesn't have the shape of a nose and he doesn't have a mouth and he doesn't talk the way we talk, that's enough that everyone can understand. And that Rambam mandated for everyone. And so the answer to your question is, and we're going to get this understanding as we go through the book, he'll be saying, we'll see more and more examples of, you know what, they don't need to know everything, right? But there's one thing that they absolutely have to know. And that is that God is not an old man with a long beard sitting on a fancy chair up in the sky, right? If you got that, you're okay, right?
Yeah, now there are many, many differences between Maimonides' approach and that of, let's say, the Catholic Church. But there's some very interesting historical parallels. For probably until just a couple hundred years ago, the Catholic Church believed that only those who could read Latin should read the Bible. And in fact, it was considered a capital offense for which you could be burned at the stake, and many thousands of people were, to translate the Bible into a language other than Latin, because the church wanted to maintain sole control over,
Interpretation.
the text and its meaning. Now, I know Rambam's motivation was very different than this, at least I think it was, but it's an interesting parallel.
Yeah, I mean, I can't comment. I'm not familiar with the Catholic theology and enough to comment, but it's odd that they would mandate Latin if none of the Bible was written in Latin, as far as I know. Not even the Christian Bible, New Testament, was written in Latin. So I don't even know what they were saying there. So
well, the reason why they required that it only be written and read in Latin was because only a few people had access to that language.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, well, I don't think, well, we'll see. I don't think Rambam, I think Rambam gives people the ability to think. He wants you to take this language and think. He's dealing with the reality of where most of the people in his world that he talked to didn't have the education or ability to get beyond that. But he's giving us the keys, and that's what we're seeing here. Any other comments on this before I go on? I'm going to go on to 18 next. If there aren't, then I will go ahead. And so chapter 18, he's going to go back to words. And sometimes it might seem a little tedious, but remember, these are all building blocks. And as we move on, the concepts are going to get deeper, and these building blocks are all going to be very important. And all of a sudden, we're going to open up the Torah and we're going to read a portion. And we've done this a few times already. And wow, it's going to mean something totally cool and totally different, or maybe not totally different, but it's going to all kind of come to light. So Karav, Vinoga, Vinigash, right, is the next three words in chapter 18. And Karav is to come close. Pines has it as to approach. Noga is to touch. These are basic, three-letter Hebrew roots. Remember, I told you, and this is just basic Hebrew. And I learned because my son's girlfriend in Israel is taking college courses there on Semitic languages, and they're studying like ancient Semitic languages, including Akkadian and Ammonite, and God knows languages that have been gone for thousands of years. But apparently, all Semitic languages are structured this way, with three-letter roots. I always knew that about Hebrew, but I didn't know that this was a characteristic of Semitic languages, of how they're built. So Karav, Vinogav, Vinogash, those are three-letter roots. Karav meaning to come close, to approach. Noga is to touch, and Nogash is to come near. That's how Pines translate approach, touch, and near. I would have approached Karav to come close, Noga to touch, and Nigash is to approach, but whatever. Either way, these three words, Kolomar, Keriva, Negia, Negisha, these three things, they're referring to closeness in space, right? In the dimension of space, things can be either close or they can be far. And Korav and Nagash means close. Both are different words that mean close, to come close. And Naga is referring to touching, when they're so close that they touch each other. And there's also, however, they also mean when one who knows something, right? When a concept that is known becomes known by a knower, meaning usually a person, right? It's similar to what happens when one body touches another, right? We know throughout the Torah that the Torah uses the language yada, to know, right? When it refers to the closest human contact between two human beings, which is sexual intercourse. But so we have that yediyah, that knowledge, referring to a touching of two bodies, right? And but here Rambam is saying that these words, all of these words referring to coming close, it is referring to also refers to knowledge, knowing. Why does it use the language? It's so often when one knows something, it says that that idea is close to him. And he's going to give us examples. So for example, as he approached the camp, now I'm sorry, I apologize, I flip back and forth from Hebrew to English, but the Pines, I'm on the bottom of 43 in chapter 18 in the last paragraph. So as he approached the camp, so that's a verse from Exodus, right? Uparo hikriv, and Pharaoh came close. So that is approaching. So that is that's the literal translation. Those are examples of where it actually means in space, and similarly, and thus Negia, her first translation is maga guf guf, when one body touches another. So vatigal raglo, and she caused it to touch his feet, and he caused it to touch my mouth. Vayiga al pi, right? That's in Isaiah, where in Isaiah's first vision, where he saw an angel. Isaiah didn't want to speak, right? Because he felt that his lips were impure. Who am I to speak? And an angel comes and touches a coal to his mouth and cleanses his mouth, touches it there. So then vayiga al pi, and then the angel said, now your mouth is cleansed, you can speak. So, and the same thing for the next word of vayigash, in negisha harishon, is Gishat Adam El Adam, as one person comes close. But most famous, Vayigash Elav Yehuda. The Torah portion of Vayigash is when Judah approached Joseph before he knew who Joseph was. He approached him. So it was referring to coming close. Fine. So those are examples of what their first meaning is. But the Inyan Sheni, the second signification, now I'm on page 44 in the Pines, the first paragraph near the top. The second one is knowledge and drawing near through apprehension, not in space. So it's not referring to space, but it's referring to knowing things. And let me give you examples. In case you think that you don't know, Rambam, in his usual manner, slams you with examples to prove his point. Thus, Scripture, using the word touching in the sense of union in knowledge, it says, for her judgment toucheth heaven. So that is Kinoga el Shamayim Mishpatah. That is from Jeremiah. Or as for approaching, and the cause is too hard for you, cause it to approach me. So this is Takrivun Eli. This is referring to where Moshe, and this is a great example, where Jethro came to Moshe and gave him advice on how to judge the people. He said, the people are lining up and they're driving you crazy. You're listening to all these petty arguments, this one and that one. Why don't you set up courts, little courts for smaller matters? And then if it's too big, they come to the next one. If it's too big, and if it's really big, then bring it to me. So, and bring it close to me. It uses the language close. What does that mean? It means bring me the matter so that I can judge it, right? So it's referring to an intellectual comprehension as opposed to actually physically bringing close. Meaning, or the same thing after coming near. It says, Vayigash Avram Vayomer, right? And Abraham came close. And this example here is where he was in a dream. So what does it mean? While he was in a state of inspiration and prophetic trance, as we will explain later, we'll get to that, right? For as much as this people came near and with their mouth and their lips do honor me. So again, here it's referring to the people came close to God with their lips. So what does that mean? That means through their prayer, through approaching God. It doesn't mean they physically came close to him. So now, Rambam is going to explain. So every mention of approaching and coming near that you find in the books of prophecy referring to a relation between God and a created being, between God and anything else, whatever that created being may be, usually a human being, but it could mean anything. It has this last meaning, because for God may be exalted is not a body, as shall be demonstrated to you in this treatise, as I will explain it to you, because we've been emphasizing this again and again. This is one, if you had to pick the most important reason for writing this book, that would be it, to convince us that God is not a body, right? And accordingly, he may be exalted, does not draw near or to or approach a thing, nor does anything draw near to or approach him. Inasmuch as the abolition of corporeality entails that space be abolished, even though it's true that philosophically, if God doesn't have a body, then God doesn't have any space at all, right? So if there is no place where he is, space is completely irrelevant when you're referring to God. So therefore, there is no nearness or proximity, no remote. He can't be near, he can't be far, he can't be together, he can't be separate. We can't be touching, we can't be not touching, right? Or no succession. I do not think that you shall grow doubtful or perplexed. I don't think that this is going to bother you for the fact that the Torah says, Karov Hashem l'chol korov, right? That's a famous verse we know from the morning prayers, right? God is close to all that call upon him. What does that mean? He's physically close? No, it means that Rambam is going to say what it means in a second. Or they take delight in approaching unto God, which is Kirvat Elokim Yechbatzon, right? Or Kirvat Elokim Lito. So these are all, the nearness of God is good for me. So what does that mean? Again, all these verses, nearness means cognition. Nearness means what's going on in our minds, what's going on in our soul. When we come close to God, meaning we experience him, we know him, we understand him. Cognitive apprehension is intended, not nearness in space. The same thing when it says, let me see. Krovim elav, meaning they are close to him, or karevat. He's going to bring more examples. I'm going to skip some of these examples. The point is made. The verse is to be interpreted in this way: unless you wish to consider that the expression "shall come near," used with reference to Moshe, might refer to the place on the mountain where he was actually standing, right? For you are free to do so. Remember, I told you these little hints where Rambam says, if you want to think in a simpler way, that when it says near to God, it means he was high up on a mountain and God was appearing to the people on the mountain. So he was close, right? Okay, right? But it's not the real deal. That's not what it really means. But if you want to think that, it's not dangerous. So here Rambam gives us permission. If you want to be a simple person, okay, that's fine. No big deal. No terrible danger. However, as long as you remember, and this answers that question that you were asking earlier, right? As to what does he want simple people to think? Well, this is what it is. It's okay if you think that being near to God means he was up on a mountain, as long as you realize, right, that the hold fast to the doctrinal principle that there is no difference whether you're standing in the center of the earth, meaning in the deepest place possible. Remember, Rambam already said this and emphasized that the world is a round globe, right? He knew this, understood this, and the Greeks knew this and understood this, and the Rambam, it's laid that down as a principle already. We had that. So in the middle of the earth, which is the deepest place and the, quote, farthest you can be from God, right? Or supposing that this were possible in the highest part of the ninth heavenly spheres, the high, way out there in space, as high as you can possibly be in space, right? It doesn't matter, for he is not farther from God in one case and no nearer to him in the other. It doesn't matter if you're standing at the top of Mount Everest or at the bottom of the Dead Sea. You can be either close or far from God. And that's obvious to us, right? Because it should be, because people like Rambam taught this to us. Remoteness from him is the lot of him who does not know him, right? Nearness consists in apprehending him. Remoteness consists in, if you know God, you're close. If you don't, you're far. That's it. And there are many gradations in being near to or far away from him in this respect. I shall explain the manner of these gradations in apprehension later. And when he discusses how prophecy works, he's going to discuss knowledge of God and its many different levels of knowing him. As for the dictum, the Torah, touch the mountains that they may smoke. Scripture signifies thereby in parabolic language. It's saying, let thy decree come to them, right? When it says to God, so to speak, the prophet says, touch the mountains so that the mountains can smoke. It means you, God, come to the people. And it says in a similar way, and touch thou him himself, meaning let thy infliction come upon him. Consider in a similar way the term touching and all its derivatives in every passage in which they occur according to this context. So whenever the word touching comes to God, it means God coming to us in a way that we can perceive him. When we perceive him, it's as if he is touching us. Sometimes the word is intended to signify the approach of one body to another, and sometimes union through the cognition and apprehension of a certain thing. For one who apprehends a thing that he did not apprehend before, has, as it were, approached it, something that was far, now it's close. Before he didn't understand it, now he does. Understand this. Okay. I want to do the next one because it's very short and it's very closely related, and then I'll open the floor for discussion. The next one is the Hebrew word maleh, right? Maleh, which means to fill, right? And maleh is a word that comes up a lot in the prophets, especially, right? Rambam is going to give us some examples, but sometimes it means simply to fill when one thing, typically a liquid, but it could be, a solid too, fills something else. Thus, for example, and she filled her pitcher. That's talking about, Rivka at the well. She filled it. An omer full for each, right? Each person had a certain amount of the manna, right? This usage is frequent. So oftenly that's what it means. That's its basic meaning. The term is likewise applied to the coming to an end and completion of a measurable period of time. When you have a period of time and it ends, meaning the time allotted for a certain event is complete, that's also called to fill. And thus we say her days were fulfilled and 40 days were fulfilled. And the term is also employed to signify the achievement of perfection in virtue and of the latter's ultimate end, right? And full with the blessing of the Lord. It's like perfection. A person has everything that he or she needed in order to achieve or accomplish something. They're completely full, or that he has filled wisdom of the heart. They are filled with wisdom and understanding. And in this sense, it is said, and when it uses the term, the whole earth is full of his glory, right? The meaning of this verse means The entire earth bears witness to his perfection. In other words, everything in the world perceives and knows God. That is the moment when the world is full of his glory. So it's similar, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle, filled the Mishkan, right? Every mention of filling that you will find referring to God is used in this sense, and not in the sense of there being a body filling a place. It doesn't mean that God physically fills the world. Again, he's emphasizing that. There's no physical being that now is taking up the whole world, but rather it means now the entire world comprehends, recognizes, realizes, acknowledges God, and most importantly, knows God. At that point, the world is full of his glory, this being the moment that we, of course, all very much look forward to. So, and again, he's going to drop a little hint, but you know what? However, if you wish to think that when it says the glory of the Lord is referring to the created light that God creates, and it is designated as glory in every passage that filled the tabernacle, because the Mishkan, the tabernacle, was lit up with God because it's like a light, and the light fills the world. There's no harm in it. So if you want to think that it's referring to light that God created and the world is full of light, okay, but that's not what it really means, right? What it really means, I'm really glad you asked the question before about so the Rambam is really giving us the edges of what's heresy and what's okay, right? It's okay to make a mistake if that's how the level that one needs to think of it. As long as you know that God is not a body and God doesn't actually fill the world. If you want to imagine it as light, go right ahead. Imagine it as light. If that's an okay metaphor for you. I'm sorry if I sound a little condescending when I say that. I kind of mean it to be a little condescending only because Rambam is condescending, not because I am. Yeah. So these are some important ideas. I want to know if anyone has anything to say. I'm going to open the floor on anything we talked about tonight. Coming close, coming near, touching, knowing, filling, or the comparison with the form and matter that we discussed before.
I have on the last point, the condescension. Since the people who are reading this are such an exclusive group, why does he need to throw in, well, if you want to go this way of the average man or whatever, fine. I mean, what's the purpose of these howevers that you've just alluded to?
If you remember, I'm really happy you brought that up, because I said in the beginning that despite the fact that Rambam says so many times, I'm writing this for all the educated people, he's clearly not writing this for all the educated people. And there's almost every other page is a proof that he's writing this for everybody. And this is one of them. And you'll find this over and over and over again, that he'll go back and say, oh, you're not supposed to teach everyone. And then he goes ahead and teaches us, right? So despite, as he had all the caveats, only the people that really need to know, really, and then boom, he teaches us, and he writes it in such a way that's clearly designed for simple people, which means all of us. So, but that's a great point that you brought it up. Okay, go ahead.
I have a question. You referred to God's, I guess I'll use the term omnipresence. Was that a term that was used back in Maimonides' times, or did he come up with the concept of this omnipresent God that exists everywhere? Or was it part of Jewish theology at the time, or do you know?
It's hard to know. Omnipresence. So it's in terms of the place. We did have this. Let me remember the chapter. Rambam talked about makom, place, right? God's place. If you remember, that was back in where was it? I think it was chapter 7 or 8, chapter 8, right, of part 1. And that was really where Rambam discussed, what it means when it says that God has a place. See, the thing is like this, and when you talk about omnipresence, that God is everywhere, that's the kind of term that Rambam generally would not have used, right? Because Rambam's understanding is kind of saying nothing that we see or know, or none of our descriptive terms, including descriptions of place, apply to God because God has no place, right? So he wouldn't have described it that way, right? Rambam would have described that, well, of course, it depends what you mean when you say he is everywhere. If you think it means he is everywhere, well, he's also nowhere, right? Because he doesn't have a place. He can't be defined by place, right? But on the other hand, there is no place where God's influence and power and creation, it doesn't exist. In other words, whatever God is everywhere, but it's also nowhere. But he would not emphasize the he is everywhere part, right? He would just emphasize the fact that we can't confine him to our human notions of place. Am I making sense? Go back to chapter 8. I can't review the whole thing, but if you have a chance, go back to chapter 8 and you'll see where he deals with makom and place. And there will be more places, but go back to chapter 8 and you'll see it.
Okay.
Any other comments on what we've done tonight?
So his view was that we lack the ability to comprehend. We lack a word in any language that we can understand to explain his being or not being.
Yes, very much so. We lack the ability to comprehend, but don't lose hope, because he will explain through his idea of what's known as the Maimonides theory of negative attributes. By consistently describing what God isn't, we start to come to a picture of what God is. We never actually get there, but we get closer and closer and closer to what God is by describing what he's not. And that's one of the main ideas that Rambam is known for, is the idea of the theology of negative attributes. I started a few weeks ago, chapter 46, and I do intend on getting back to where I was up to. That was the beginning of Rambam driving in that direction. He started drilling down by saying he's not this, he's not this, he's not this, and it's going to go round and round and round until you get closer and closer to understanding God. I mean, we're never going to ever get there, and that's the main point. But we'll get closer and closer. So yeah, and that's I saw a really interesting article recently where someone describes the difference between the mystical or Kabbalistic understanding of God, which uses tons of descriptions of God, describing God as describing all these incredibly powerful things. God is all powerful, all loving, all forgiving, all describing with all these attributes, right? And Rambam doing the exact opposite. He's not this, he's not this, he's not this. And then both of those paths ending up in the same place, which is a place where God is so great that we have no way of understanding him, but ultimately we have no way of understanding him. So, and how you get there is like two different directions, but you end up in the same spot. I'll try to, if some people want to text me afterwards, and I'll send them this article, but it's really an article about the Maimonidean opposition to Kabbalah, to the development of Kabbalah, which is Jewish mysticism. And the Maimonides and his disciples and followers for centuries afterwards classically became opponents of Kabbalah in most cases, not all cases, but in general. And this article tracks that, but he does make the point that ultimately they seem to end up in the same place, despite the fact that they argued and screamed and yelled at each other. But that's a subject for an interesting talk. I'm sorry, I went off on a tangent, but any other comments? If there isn't, then we'll call today a close then. And I hope to really appreciate everyone being here, and I hope to continue next week. All right. All right. So everyone have a wonderful evening. And
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Be well. Bye-bye.
Here. Bye-bye.